I'm really happy to be here. This is such a great festival. Thanks to Sue Ellen and everybody for organizing it, and the Harbor View, and the Gazette and the magazine, which I work for co-working on it too. We have a great panel. We have a broad and deep and wide and amorphous subject by the sea.
And cold.
and cold, and more often cold than not, but warming rapidly, right? And I have four wonderful novelists here. I'm just going to introduce them really briefly, and we're going to kind of have a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then I'll open it up to questions. And as I was saying to the panel, I hope that they will feel free to just interject and keep the conversation going. I'll try to keep it going if there's any problem, but with four scribblers and one moderating scribbler, I'm sure we'll fill up the time without much problem. So starting down at the far end, we have Peter Nichols, who is a adventurer and writer who has done some remarkable books. And his newest one is The Rocks. It's a novel. I confess that I did not receive any of these books until the day before yesterday, so I've dipped into some of them, and I haven't really read them, so we're going to be sailing blind a little bit in terms of specifics. But he has a long list of books that he has written. And then next we have Jennifer Tseng, who, is that how you pronounce it? Tseng? Tseng. Tseng. Jennifer Tseng, who is a acclaimed poet and has her first novel has just come out, and she lives here on the Vineyard, I believe, still, right?
I just
She just moved.
So sad.
That is sad.
I
Well, we'll hear.
cry during the presentation.
Okay, we'll hear more about that. And it's a lovely novel that I have just dipped into myself. It's called Mayumi and the Sea of Happiness, so we have the subject right in the title. Next we have Liza Klaussmann. Klaussmann or Klaussmann?
Klaussmann.
Klaussmann, who had a very successful book 2 years ago or 3 years ago,
Three.
Tigers in Red Weather, and it was. I have not read it, I confess. And she has a new novel out. Is it Villa or Villa?
Villa.
Villa America, which takes place by the sea in the Mediterranean, and we'll hear about that. And then next to me is John Benditt, who also has a new first novel, although he's a very accomplished journalist and editor for various magazines in New York and at MIT and elsewhere. And his new book is called The Boatmaker, and I've read in it as well. So, and I have read enough of all. The only one that I didn't receive at all is The Rocks, but I've read an earlier book by Peter, and I know I will read The Rocks, and I've read enough of the other three to know that I'm going to finish them all as soon as I get back to my porch. So I just want to, the topic is the sea. The topic is kind of broad and wide and amorphous, as I said, and I really want to just throw it out to these writers to sort of say, in a way, give a little nutshell of their own relationship to the ocean. Maybe it's the first memory, maybe they grew up by the sea, maybe they've always been a fanatical sailor. I don't know them personally, so I'd like to hear a little bit of that, and then how that informed their new book. And I guess, why don't we just go left to right, which for me would be left to right, so that's right, left.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? I did not grow up I grew up sort of near the sea, but paid no attention to it until long story, I ended up living on a small wooden sailboat for many years, had no engine, no electricity, and I had no money. And a boat is something that exhibits a constant desire to sink, nothing more so than a wooden boat, and having to therefore keep it afloat for years, and not having electricity. I didn't have any TV or anything like that, so I lived on this little boat for many years, and I read a lot about the sea, and that's really how I became intimately acquainted with the sea. And then my boat sank. That was also an intimate, interesting experience, and I crawled ashore and began writing. That's sort of briefly it.
Okay.
And that informs all of my books, although, so I wrote some books that were maritime themed, and then I felt that I was written out on the sea. So my latest book is a novel about dysfunctional people and their relationships, which I also know something about. And it's next to the sea, but it has just as much about real estate and children and sex as the sea. Thank you.
Thanks.
What a great story. I grew up in California, about 12 miles away from the ocean. But you know, when you're a child, you just go where people take you. So I didn't get to go very often. We went once a year to see the fireworks. And before that, well, I was born in Indiana, but I have actually had a kind of intimate relationship with the sea since the day I was born. If you know my poetry, you'll know that my father was an immigrant and he named me for the sea. The name Jennifer means white wave. And throughout my life, he would always bring it up. Isn't that a beautiful meaning? Isn't that a beautiful meaning? And in my mind, I was seeing the visual, the white waves breaking on the shore. And it never clicked for me until later in his life when he was dying and he insisted on being buried in this grave that overlooked the sea, that I realized for him that the sea was this emblem of China, which was a country that he came from. And so it became that for me as well. And you could think of it as the thing that connects the two places or the thing that separates them. So anyway, it's become this beautiful meaning for me in a different way. And the book that I wrote, Mayumi and the Sea of Happiness, the sea is a presence. It's funny, the cover would lead you to believe that it's more about the sea than it is, because it really takes place very much in the woods of Martha's Vineyard. That's where all of the action takes place. But it is a constant presence, and what I like about the cover and the title is that your relationship to that Sea of Happiness, to the title, changes as you read the book. I don't want to give too much away, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, is this, yeah? Can you guys hear me? There we go. My experience with the sea actually originates here in Edgartown. I spent all my summers here as a child. And my first memory, I think, of the ocean, weirdly, is actually sitting in a bathtub after being at the beach and licking my knee and the taste of the salt on your skin, you know? So that's my real memory of it. And I can't now, my first novel took place here, and the second one takes place on the Mediterranean. And I can't really now imagine writing a book that doesn't include the ocean. I really can't. I think it's very primal. It's like really, if you grow up around it, or maybe if you dream of it growing up, if your name is that, I don't know. But it's something that, you know, I think becomes kind of part of you. I mean, there is that sort of extreme experience of the ocean and the danger as a child and all of that. And that's kind of what I think about when I think about the ocean. I think about Edgartown, I think about Martha's Vineyard. It's the Atlantic, really, for me. So writing about the Mediterranean in my second book was a strange experience. It's a very different ocean. It's very calm, very blue, very, very, in a lot of ways not as salty, unless you're in Greece, in which case it's insanely salty. But yeah, so it's a different, this one is such a green. I was swimming the other day off of South Beach, and you know, the waves are so big, and there's so much seaweed, and there's so much plant life, and it really is, you know, really ocean.
You haven't sucked your knee in the Mediterranean then, because it is
I
actually
licked
saltier
it.
than the Atlantic.
Yeah, I should give it a lick. I should
Yeah.
give it a lick next time. But yeah, so that's sort of my relationship to it.
Great. John?
Yes, thank you. I grew up in Seattle, which is very close to the sea. The sea is all around in Seattle. It's also a country of cold green islands. And the sea in Seattle is a little different than it might be in some of the other places that people have talked about. It's not a great country for swimming. The ocean is very cold almost all the year, right into the summer. The beaches are often very rocky, sometimes steep. So the sea isn't exactly a kind of warm and welcoming place the way it might be in the Mediterranean, for example, or in the Caribbean. So that was my background, the combination of the cold northern sea and the green islands with, you know, evergreen forests on them. And I think in some way, as you know, we all know as writers, things that happen to us, particularly as children, seep into us and come out later in some different form, some transformed form. And so in my novel, The Boatmaker, there's a man who grows up on a small island, not so different from the island that we're on, and he builds a boat and sails away from that island into a kind of a different life. And so I think somehow for me, having grown up in Seattle with that cold sea all around, the idea became that the sea was a way of getting out. And I don't know why that was. I couldn't tell you it would take years of psychoanalysis, which I don't have time for at this point, but for me to find out why that's the case. But for me, the sea became a kind of a way out, a road forward, a kind of a highway toward a different kind of self. And the boatmaker in the novel sees it that way, and although he's never built a boat, doesn't know how to build a boat, at least sort of explicitly. He's a worker in wood, but doesn't know how to build a boat. And that knowledge is pretty closely held, as it is in some small places, by families who are boat builders. In spite of that, he wants to build a boat and sail away onto this cold sea.
Thanks. I've read in The Boat Builder, and it is a remarkable book, at least as far as I've gotten. And it seems to me that something you said brings up a question that I have. I mean, you mentioned the sea as an outward, as a road out.
Yes.
You know? But there also is, the sea as this barrier.
Yes.
Particularly when you're on an island or an insular quality that the ocean can have, or a, lock you down kind of feeling.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious whether, in any of your writing, how do you see the ocean in your characters? Is it a maybe it's just a backdrop, but maybe it's a route out? As you said, I'm wondering if the other writers look at the ocean as a barrier or a freeing
For me, it's
sort
more
of
of
thing.
I think of a kind of sensual experience, in the sense that I feel like my characters sort of experience as I did, I suppose, the salt and the sea. It's not a highway, to
Right.
me, or something that sort of keeps people in. It's neither. It's like the furniture in your house. It's just there, and you sit on it sometimes and you experience it that way. But I don't see it as
I see it as another country.
Uh-huh.
It's really a foreign place, and very much so by its medium, but also what happens to you there and the sort of people who go there. When I was living on my boat, the people that I knew also living on small boats, they were sort of people who had retreated to the water's edge and could go no farther. They were societal misfits, and they ended up living on these small boats and just being offshore, just a little bit like the boats out here. They were actually in a different place, in a different country, and there was this sort of nationality that we all shared. And I found that dynamic very interesting, and I think that informed then everything I subsequently wrote, because I like marginalized characters. I relate to them in some way, and so that very much is what the sea is to me, what boats are to me. They're sort of conveyances or capsules, like rocket ships, into another, country or universe or dimension.
Right. And go ahead.
Well, it's in The Boatmaker. That's an interesting question, because I think the farther north you go, the experience of the sea actually changes, because what you're talking about is typical of the Mediterranean, where it's all around, and it is very sensual, and it's combined with the experience of the sun, right? In the farther north you go, in the very dark places in Scandinavia, toward the Arctic, the sea is something very different. People don't swim a lot, right? A lot of people who live on those small islands don't know how to swim. A lot of fishermen, a lot of sailors didn't know how to swim in the 19th century. So as far as the characters in The Boatmaker go in relation to the sea, for most of them, it starts on a very small island, which happens to be called I don't think I'm giving anything away, small island, right? Some writers are so original.
Brilliant,
You know,
John. Yeah.
it starts on small island, and the sea is all around. It's omnipresent, but it's not welcoming. You wouldn't want to jump into the sea and go for a relaxing swim. It's not that kind of sea, even in summer. So for most of the characters, it's a given that really keeps them there. It's a small, insular place. It keeps them there. It prevents them from leaving. The protagonist, who's called the boat maker, there's something in him that makes him want to get away, and his only route out is the sea.
Mm-hmm. And Jennifer, in your book, I remember there's a lovely description of this island during a storm, where you feel like the whole how in a real storm on the Vineyard, you kind of feel like we're a boat at sea on the island.
Right, the island itself is this kind of boat, and we're all just in this storm together.
Yeah, hunkered down in a way.
Yeah, and I think for her, because you can, unless you own oceanfront property, you can really spend a lot of your time on this island and never see the ocean. A lot of people live in the woods and never see it, or rarely see it. And so for this character who spends a lot of time in the woods, it is also just an emblem of the greater world. And her relationship to that changes throughout the book.
But don't you think that it's also true that in some islands, I mean, what you were saying suggested to me, in some islands, there's a very inward-facing kind of quality, especially in smaller islands where people have lived for generation after generation. And you're right, they don't necessarily connect to the sea, but there's a kind of deep connection among them. They all know each other. There are deep, connections, obligations, and resentment sometimes that go back for generation after generation in these very small places. They tend to be quite inward-facing, I think.
Yeah, I think even bigger islands as well. I mean, you do have island mentality. I live in Britain, in fact, and they really do have an island mentality.
Yeah, right.
It's just a bigger island,
Yeah.
And I think that is a very I'm fond of islands. It's quite an eccentric experience, which I really like, and they have their own way of doing things. And I mean, how long have you lived here for before you moved?
Around 8 years.
That's a long time. Yeah.
Where are you going? Or where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?
I'm not exactly sure, but I might be going to Brookline.
Brookline.
Oh,
So not so
that's
far.
nice.
Not
Not an island.
Not Brooklyn?
Not an island.
Yeah,
Not Brooklyn?
an island.
Okay, great. And a kind of a technical question, I've only written nonfiction, so I don't write fiction. And in some ways, I wonder, kind of, as novelists, have you described this, used the description of the weather or the sea to reflect a particular character or to expand on a mood? It was a dark and stormy night.
Yeah, I mean, I
A
think
type
that's the
of-
problem with that.
you-
You do sort of run into cliche if you start using the ocean as like, it was,
Yeah.
she felt tempestuous and the ocean responded.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't think,
It ripped her body.
But, yeah, exactly. But I do think it's wonderful for creating atmosphere because it has so much, it has sound, it has smell, it has taste, it has everything, and it can be carried on the air. So I think that it is something where somebody can be thinking one thing and they could be covered in salt, they could be thinking, they could smell something, they could, so I do think it does create an amazing sense of atmosphere.
I think it's a wonderful canvas in which to, or proscenium, or place in which to place characters, because I think the sea is very, it's not malevolent, it has no essential character except its indifference to us. It's like we are like mayflies in front of a speeding Buick or something. It just, it is not interested in us, and we go there at our peril or pleasure or whatever, but it is a very elemental sort of blank canvas, and we can, as writers, we can, shake it up wonderfully, and as Conrad did, but it's just a wonderful place to put people, to pit them against not the sea, because what happens when people go to sea is they don't meet the sea, they meet their essential selves. And I think that's the thing that really happens at sea.
Well, and actually, I think that's a very good point, because what I was going to say in answer to your question was, certainly in my novel, The Boatmaker, I'm not a nonfiction writer, not at all, and I didn't do any research for the book per se. What happens at the moment when the sea is really at its most intense are the moments when important things are happening to the character, right? So there's a kind of inner and outer connection between the kind of peak experience of the character and what's happening with the sea or the weather.
When,
So it's not nonfiction.
A nonfiction book I wrote was called A Voyage for Madmen, and it's about the first nonstop solo race around the world. 9 men set out to sail around the world alone, nonstop. They weren't necessarily sailors. Only one of them left. When he left, the day he left, he didn't know how to sail or navigate. And some friends of his went ahead in a boat, and they said, "Do what we do. And when you get out into the English Channel, turn right." And that's that's the Atlantic. And so these guys went out there, and what happened is exactly what I said. What was so interesting to me about that story was they all went to the same place, out into the ocean, down the Atlantic, around the bottom of the world. Not quite all of them, but they had completely different experiences, and their experience in the same place, doing the same thing, was entirely dependent on who they were. So psychologically, it was about meeting themselves, and they found their own demons, and they succeeded or failed spectacularly according to who they were, not anything to do with any storm or boat.
I think that also the ocean sort of, the inevitable thing about it is that it represents a potential for death. I mean, that really is it,
Yeah.
That's what makes it sort of interesting to write about, because anyone can die in it, and we sort of know that about it, It could just be an accident, and it happens. So I think that sort of gives it its edge. I think that's why people also, are constantly writing about it, because it's like nature is a graveyard in a way,
Right. Well, and it's also certainly, a kind of theater of great extremes, because it can also be very benevolent,
Yeah.
right? You can sail, and it can be simple, like sailing in a bathtub, right? And
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
No, something about, something that you said, John, about the when the sea is at its most tempestuous, there's
Intense,
stuff going
yeah.
on, intense, there's
Intense, yeah.
things going on with the character.
Yes.
It made me think actually of that book by Peter Matheson, Far Tortuga, where there's nothing going on in the sea, and they're lying, there's also this becalmed thing that can,
Yes.
that it's intense in that it's deadly, and yet it's not. And you know what I mean?
confronted
Well,
with
no
yourself.
wind too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that can be
Yeah.
deadly, just as deadly.
Yeah. So 2 of the novels, I did notice, start out with a dead body in the first paragraph at sea.
Yeah.
And without any spoilers.
Well, I think if it's in the first paragraph, it's not a spoiler.
Well, there's a little more hanging, though, in Liza's. Yeah. But I'm curious as to whether you wrote the first paragraph first. I mean, in my books, I'm always, it's always this thing of finding the point of entry into a nonfiction book. And it doesn't always start, you don't always start with, it doesn't always end up, at least with my lovely editor, he doesn't always like my initial choice of point of entry, and we figure that out. But did you write?
I wrote it last, actually.
Last.
The first book I wrote, beginning to end, and this one, I wrote that, the prologue last.
Well, in my case, the story's a little odd because I didn't really know that I was writing a novel. I thought that I was writing a short story. I was taking a writing workshop, and I wrote a short story. And even the first short story, I don't know that it was in the first paragraph, but that first short story did have the death in it that you're talking about. And the death actually doesn't take place in the book. It has happened already when the book begins. But it's the result of the action of the sea. I mean, it's connected with the sea, and so it's it's the backstory of the book, and it hangs over everything. And it goes back to what you're saying about the sea is this potent force that can kill,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, that's what makes it exciting, right? It's like it has a kind of, death and sex and life, and, it's like got it all going on.
And enormous energy sometimes. I mean, and great extremes.
Yeah.
Great extremes.
Yeah, and potential for great pleasure. I mean, there's so much, there's something so playful about the sea as well. There's something so much like, I look at, little kids and they're splashing around and parents want them to be in there. I mean, there is something amazing about it.
Yes,
It's an incredible,
absolutely.
incredible thing.
And what about, let's talk a little more about the personalities of different oceans, because one of them, you know, two of your books are in the Mediterranean. Yours is not fully defined, but it certainly has a northern kind of feeling, or at least I haven't gotten far enough to figure out whether it was, you know, and Jennifer's is here on the vineyard, but it's a year-round here on the vineyard. It's not this sort of summer frolicking ocean. And you're on the Mediterranean as well. Could each of these oceans brings its kind of own, you know, we think of the Mediterranean, we already think, oh, sunny Mediterranean, Northern Sea. We kind of talked a little bit more about that, but I mean, could your book have been set in the Pacific? Or what would happen if you moved your story to another ocean? I mean, what is it, if anything? I mean, maybe it's, or to the mountains, or to the plains. I mean, in a sense.
Well, I think mountains have a lot in common with the sea, and many sailors are mountaineers. But I think, yeah, my story could have taken place, I think, in anywhere. You know, it happened to be that I knew Majorca, I know the Mediterranean. I grew up on spending a lot of time on the island of Majorca. And so mostly, but my story is about people misbehaving or doing what they do, and they could have done it anywhere. So I think in that sense, my Mediterranean is not really, it doesn't have an essential character in this book. And so it could have happened in Hawaii or
people misbehave everywhere.
People are people, yes, exactly. But I do think there is an essential character in, you know, the Pacific is, historical accounts of the Pacific being so vast and Pacific, which of course it's not.
Right.
And we think of the Atlantic as less so, but the Atlantic can have terribly bad weather, as we all know. The Mediterranean is thought to be, you know, it's seen as a sea rather than an ocean, and it's small, but you can have terrible weather in the Mediterranean because it doesn't have the long thousands of miles for sea swell to be sort of, you know, a tsunami out at sea is 18 inches high, and then it gets to the shore and it rears up to 50 feet or whatever. So the Mediterranean has the same effect, where because of the proximity of land in all directions, you can have very, very bad seas in the Mediterranean, as you can in the Great Lakes. Same principle.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, but, you know, and then that's all weather driven. So the sea is, it can be anything. For a writer, it's great. It can be anything. Anything you want to do, you posit your situation and your people there, and then you can throw whatever you want at them.
But I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. The ocean does have a very specific character depending on where you are and which ocean you're in. And I do think, as I was saying before, the farther north you go, the colder it is, the less the ocean is a thing that's about pleasure. Right, and the boat. I don't think the boat maker could have been set in the Mediterranean, for example, because of the quality of the sea that's around Small Island when he begins. It's not, the sea is not something that people swim in. It's not something that they're in. It's something that they're on. Right.
Yeah, and you were saying about, you know, they don't swim or they don't. I mean, early seamen, most sailors did not know how to swim, and they had a horror of the sea. And the first man to sail alone around the world, Joshua Slocum, did not know how to swim either. Right. And so I think
you
would think that's the first thing you would learn before setting sail.
Yeah. No, but
it's kind of crazy.
He didn't know, and I think it's true of most professional seamen, is they have a horror of the sea. They fear it, and respect.
And I do think that in different areas, people have different relationships to the sea and to the water, and it's, you know, it has greater pleasure or lesser pleasure associated with it. And I think that character, that kind of cold, forbidding character, is part of the atmosphere of the boatmaker.
I'm going to open it up to. Oh, Jennifer, sorry, I didn't realize you wanted to add something. Sorry, please.
Well, although
You are the sea, so I mean, tell us.
Yes, I do have to confess that my book doesn't have a ton of stuff about the sea, but it's a story of sexual obsession, which I think happens everywhere, could happen anywhere, but because it was set here, especially because it was set on an island, her sexual obsession is filtered through that constantly. That's how she sees the water as this place that could potentially carry her away from her obsession. She sees herself as standing on the same piece of earth as this character who she's obsessed with. And if she were to remove herself from the island, and move on to another piece of earth, then she would not have the chance of encountering him. So for her, it all traces back to that.
Thanks. I was going to open it to question, but something you said just made me think that there's a quality of obsession in a lot of sea-based stories and obviously Moby Dick, but and somewhat in the beginnings of your book, what is it about the ocean that creates a sort of maybe it's the unfathomableness of it or the broadness?
Very good, unfathomable. I like it, but I think it's also the thing that Mallory said about Everest. It's there because it's there. It's just such a looming, huge thing, and of course 7/8 of the world's surface or whatever it is, but it's just there. So.
But I think
It's
it,
a relentless rhythm too. I mean, it just keeps doing the same thing, similar thing
Right.
over
Yeah.
and over
Good
again.
point. It's obsessive in its own
It's
right.
an obsessive
Yeah.
creature. It's
Yeah.
Rhythmic. It's lifelike.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously
but I
the
think
spring
there's also
from it.
something
and-
about setting off on the sea that requires a kind of obsession, right? If you're willing to set off on the sea, especially somebody like Joshua Slocum, right, or many other sailors who've done long voyages single-handedly or with a small crew, you have to be obsessional to be willing to accept the loneliness and the very, very reduced circumstances of living on a small boat.
kind of like writing a novel.
Yes.
Reduced
You have to
circumstances,
be
indeed.
somewhat
Yeah.
obsessional to write books, I've discovered.
Yeah.
I'd love to have any questions from the audience. I mean, we can keep it going if there aren't any, but I'm sure there will be. Please come and use the microphones if you do have questions. And if
Here comes
here
someone.
comes somebody.
A nice breaker.
I actually wanted, Mr. Benditt, if you don't mind, can you elaborate on the mountaineering and,
No, I think you mean Mr. Nichols.
excuse me,
probably.
Mr. Nichols, the mountaineering and the ocean going, and why a lot of sailors are also mountaineers?
Has anyone heard of H.W. Tillman? He was an English mountaineer, and he sort of pioneered the route up to Everest in the 1930s, before World War II, that Sir Edmund Hillary later took. And Tillman was an extremely ascetic, interesting man, and he believed in climbing without oxygen, and one of the reasons he didn't go back to Everest after World War II was that he didn't want to climb with oxygen. So he then, having spent most of his professional career as a mountaineer, he bought an old leaky wooden boat in England, and he spent the rest of his life sailing this leaky boat on the same sort of quest. He would sail it to Patagonia or wherever, or some little island group somewhere, and climb mountains there. But I think he liked the challenge and the fear and the pitting himself against this implacable, immutable element. And in that sense, the sea and the oceans and mountains have very much the same thing. And it's this thing that man, the species does, and why people wanted to, uselessly sail around the world. It's some Odyssean quest that people have, that mankind has. In fact, someone wrote a book called The Ulysses Factor, that we have this desire to sort of pit ourselves, or a few people do. And the rest of the people, watch or read newspaper accounts about these loony people who go off and climb mountains or sail oceans. And Into Thin Air, John Krakauer's book, was hugely popular because of this. Everyone got into trouble on the top of Mount Everest, and people get into trouble at sea.
Do
And
you think,
read,
though, it's also partially about height, though? 'Cause you know what I mean? The height of the waves, the height of the mountains. I was thinking about...
There's a
you
vertigo
know,
in both cases, yeah.
And, a lot of the people who built skyscrapers before they had all the sort of tools to make it safe were people who had been seamen, who climbed masts, who didn't get vertigo. And I feel like there's something in that, isn't there? There's some height issue.
Well, there's a kind of vertiginous exposure in either
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I guess my question is for John. Do you have a wooden boat, or what inspired you to
No, I
use
don't.
that?
I don't own a wooden boat. In fact, I don't own any boats at all. I always have loved boats. As I said, I grew up in Seattle. My father was a sailor, and so I spent some time on boats when I was younger. And then I also spent some time in Maine, where I actually got to know a guy who was a wooden boat builder, and I spent some time in his boats. So my interest as a writer, my book really, it certainly, as I said before, I did very little research per se. But I knew something about boats, and actually tomorrow I'm going to be introduced by a boat builder, and I hope that he'll be gentle with my errors about the boat. So I'm very interested in boats, I love boats, and I love craftsmanship, and somehow that all kind of came together into the idea of a character who builds a boat and sails away. But it's not, they say first novels are autobiographical, and this one, it really isn't an autobiography. It brings together and synthesizes some things that I've been interested in for a long time, and that I really am that I admire a great deal, but aren't necessarily me. You're welcome.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on the ocean as sustenance. My father-in-law was born and raised down here on the island, never swam. Didn't know how to swim.
Right.
Constantly in the ocean,
Right.
cohogging or scalloping or fishing or whatever he was doing. So I was thinking about the ocean more of a life sustenance type of thing. So if you could comment on that.
Sure, I'd be happy. I mean, at least in the Boatmaker, my novel, the ocean is the main source of sustenance, and everybody makes their living in relation to the sea. And there's a steamer that comes from Big Island, which is the next island over, and brings certain things from civilization, but everything else comes basically directly out of the sea. And so I think then it becomes, it's like the land for land-dwelling people. It becomes the thing in the medium in which you live.
Yeah, I mean, I think for my book, Villa America, they're definitely not using the sea as a sort of form of sustenance, because they're just sort of misbehaving and
Right.
drinking too much to worry about that. But but I mean, again, this sort of thinking about what you were saying, I feel like that's another sort of part of the sea, this sort of the sensual experience, which is also the taste and the things you eat that come out of it, and all of that sort of stuff. And I guess that's sort of how I approach it. And I don't have a workaday sort of relationship to the sea in the same way that somebody who lives on an island and works it would know about it,
Right.
Well, Liza, both you and Peter's book are people misbehaving by the sea.
Yes.
And, to some degree, maybe Jennifer's as well, even though it's in the woods.
Misbehaving near the sea.
Misbehaving within earshot of the sea.
Yeah.
But I wonder if I don't want to cut off any questions, but I wonder if there's something, I think one of the reasons that we were given this subject is, we obviously live by the sea here, but we have this summer community, and I'm not saying they misbehave any more or less than the year-round community, but is there something about kind of when people go to be by the sea for a brief time or for a season, or I think
I'm
of
not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure it has to do with the sea. I think wherever people go for a brief time, they leave sort of destruction behind them. Because you don't have that sense that anyone's going to remember.
Well, they step out of their lives. But I guess, when you come here, you take off your clothes, too, to some extent. So when you get into a bathing suit, and maybe that's conducive to,
Well, summer in general, right?
Yes,
Hot
right.
weather,
Right.
the clothes start coming off,
Right.
and things go downhill from
Yeah.
there, really, don't they?
Uphill
maybe not.
or uphill.
Yeah, uphill, yeah.
Does anyone not think about it when they come to, the seaside, and do they think about tennis or boats or what? Yes.
Well, I mean, I haven't, as I said, I haven't gotten far enough in your novel to,
Yeah.
but is there sort of a relationship between the sort of year-round people on the coast and these
Yeah, I mean, I think the
interlopers from
people,
America
yeah, I mean, I think
who are,
the people that I've written about in both of my novels are definitely not year-rounders where they are. They're definitely like sort of potentially people who come year after year, but it's still a kind of seasonal experience.
Well, they're out of their regular context.
Yeah, and that,
There's a
you
kind
know,
of freedom in that.
yeah, there is, and I mean, you can sort of look at characters as, destructive in a way too, which always makes a character more interesting when they're misbehaving slightly,
Right.
when they're not perfect, when they're a little ugly, and so you can kind of look from the outside, you can think about what people who do live year-round think about that, and you sort of create them that way.
Yeah. I'd like to just, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to return just for a second to the thing about sustenance, because I think, as I said, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and I think the Northwest, like New England, is a place where the sea was a source of sustenance, and people always lived on that. And so in that respect, I think that kind of seeped into my book as well, but I do think in New England it was a practical matter, as it was in the Pacific Northwest for a long time. So, I'm sorry, Jennifer, Jennifer wanted to say
So
something.
Jennifer, yeah.
Oh, and as always, I'm sort of veering away from the sea, but I was interested in this conversation of the year-round population versus the summer group. Because here, if you live here year-round, typically, with a few exceptions probably, when summer comes, you are super duper busy. It's not your time to relax. And if anything, you might also be hosting people. And so in my experience, and I set out a book that would explore this, winter is actually the hottest time on this island. And that's when things are quiet and there are a lot of secret things happening
Ferment.
in the woods. So.
That don't show up on the police blotter, right? That's my favorite thing to read.
Just everybody reads the police blotter all winter.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. A lot goes on in Oak Bluffs, apparently, yeah.
We only have a few more minutes, so if there are any more questions from the audience, I'd love to entertain them. Yes.
So I have a question, just like as authors, when do you write? Like, Jennifer, you're a librarian. Is this your career, or is this just something that you do for fun? And when do you make the time? Do you set it aside, or do you just write all day long?
For me, it's 4:30 a.m.
Wow.
So it's before
No,
my
no,
child
no.
wakes up and before the library's open.
I'm a full-time author, so I generally get up and try to get going. Yeah, around this is also a long experience. So by noon, no. I'd probably start writing around 10, and it depends what part of the book I'm in. I find that the beginning of the book, I can only write for 2 or 3 hours at a time, but by the time I'm sort of halfway to getting towards the end, I can go for 8. It's like training for a marathon. By the time you're getting right towards the end of it, you really can go for hours, I find.
Well, I had a long career as a journalist, mostly as a scientific journalist, and then I had to do it in and around the other work. And about 12 or 13 years ago, I kind of reorganized my life because I wanted to make the writing the focus of it. And now I work every day, 6 days a week. But when I'm writing, I find that I can only write with really full concentration for an hour or 2 hours, especially when I'm writing a first draft. But I do try to treat it like a job. I find that works the best for me.
Yeah.
If I get up and I do it for the hour or 2 hours until I find that I'm kind of losing concentration, it's not by the clock, but it's by the feeling of having done enough for that day and beginning to lose the edge. And that works for me. Writers are very, very different.
Yeah, banker's hours. I get up and I go to work, but again, the concentration is such that, we sound so feeble or whatever, but
Fragile.
fragile that
Hothouse flowers.
But a couple of hours of writing, and I have to stop or go to Trader Joe's or something or take a walk. But basically, I'm doing it all day, unless my son is with me, and then I stash him in a room with a machine or something.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, I think one last. This is, or do you have one more also? No, this is the last one then.
This is for Peter Nichols over here. You mentioned that people living on boats tend to think they have an additional kind of nationality. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, I think, as I said, that they seem to be, and the people that I was talking about are people who really, they were misfits in a way. I'm not talking about retirees who, have expensive boats and they go off but people who live on boats as I did for years at a time, they have a community. I mean, I would sail around, I would see people in the Caribbean, and I'd meet the same people in Gibraltar or the Azores. Oh, how are you? You know, what have you been doing? And it was this floating community. And in that way, it was like, you know, you would recognize each other, and you would share the same interests, and you'd also share the same detachment from the world. You were this floating community. And I think it was very much like that with whalers and professional seamen in the 18th, 19th century, which is why I'm very drawn to Martha's Vineyard and the history here. So in that sense, they're people who are doing a certain thing, and they identify with that world and that lifestyle and some of the difficulties of it, and also but a sense of estrangement from the more privileged people that they perceive as more privileged, who live ashore in places like this too. If that answers your question.
All right, I think we've run out of time. I
Thank
just
you.
want to thank all the authors again, and thank all of you for coming, and they will be signing